Welcome to Parentless Podcast. Please note that in this show you may hear graphic descriptions or language that may not be appropriate for everyone. Listener discretion advised. Hey friends, welcome in. I'm Stephanie, your host of Parentless Podcast. Today I sit down with Meghan. She is a psychotherapist out of the DC area. She has such amazing information to share with us today. I'm so excited to be able to bring this to you. She brought so much information to me that I needed 2 episodes for her. So this is part 1 of 2. Be on the lookout for part 2 coming soon. Thank you so much for listening to Parentless Podcast. Take care.
So my name's Meghan Riordan Jarvis. I am a psychotherapist based in Washington, D.C., and I've been a trauma and grief-informed therapist for about 20 years. I have a husband, a dog, 3 kids. We've all been sort of stuck together during COVID all this time. And I'm also a writer. I'm a recent new writing through grief proponent, and I run a grief workshop, a grief writing workshop through my blog and website, Grief is My Side Hustle. And it's a free workshop that's sort of more therapeutic in nature than it presents itself. It's based on a lot of my work over the past 20 years in learning how to begin to process grief. So yeah, that's me.
This is a fact in the ducks on your city.
Little oval face that makes me sad comes and goes by. Could wrote the book of Joe instead. Oh, to go now. Heavy eyes, so help me make this bed over and over. Tell me what it takes to make you stay so lonely.
Welcome to Parentless Podcast. I'm so stoked that you were able to drop by.
Me too. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. And I don't know, just from I got to say that I found you on Instagram.
You did.
Yeah. And you were so nice to reach out to me and offer to be a guest. And I wanted to tell you that I love that because it did definitely take off some of the pressure of finding people. And so it was just great to have you come forward. So thank you very much.
Well, and I love your, Instagram often does this lovely thing where it suggests other things for you to follow. And when you're interested in a topic like grief, you can end up, it's like listening to Christmas carols all year round. You can end up, so I'm pretty careful to not put things in my feed that I don't think are worthwhile. And I have listened to all your podcasts and I love them. I know you're getting up and getting going with this, but it's not everybody can make this topic like an educational, interesting topic. So it's a mutual love affair for us. So thanks.
Oh, thank you. And when I started this, I wasn't sure who I was going to have on, but the fact that this is your career,
it is.
You do this for, your job. This is what you're made of. And then for you to be kind of forced into, as we all are at some point, to experience it for yourself. So there's a lot of stuff that I think we can get into today.
Part of what's been interesting for me in the past 3 years is being more of a consumer of my own field, right? So I work primarily, if you had asked me 5 years ago, I would have told you that I was a trauma therapist with a grief and loss specialty. And I think now I would tell you that I'm a grief and loss specialist who also deals with trauma. And it's almost like it's semantics, except it isn't. Trauma, by its definition, essentially means that you had a nervous system overload at some point. At some point, your body's ability to manage the situation that's in front of it is overwhelmed. And for some people, that trauma then sort of defines how they move through life forever. And so that's the work I've done. And the work that I've done in trauma work, it's less talk therapy-ish and more bottom-up therapy, which is, helping your body shake out the 5 senses experience of being traumatized. So if you and I are in a car accident You might walk out of that car accident and go tell it as a funny story to a bunch of colleagues at cocktails, and I might never get in a car again. So you're not traumatized. I am traumatized. The event, of course, is traumatic. So there's a lot of conversation right now about like, oh, COVID, and we're all going through this collective trauma. We are all going through a collective trauma. We're not all going to be traumatized from it, right? So part of what's been interesting for me is that with my dad's death, which was in 2017, I was not traumatized. I was able to participate in that, and I'll talk more about that. I didn't make meaning in any sort of negative way. It wasn't limiting in my belief system. It was incredibly difficult and hard, but more a traditional grieving process, just traditional loss. With my mom's death, it was traumatizing. I was deeply traumatized, and I ended up in inpatient treatment for 3 weeks in order to break through the trauma. And so part of the reason that and to, regain my capacity to be inside my body, like in a safe way. So part of the reason I like to talk about it is most people don't really know the difference. And there is an element of grief, which includes all of the parts that exist in being traumatized, right? So the five senses being overwhelmed, it's kind of like sitting with someone and them telling you their birth story, right? Like, oh, and then my water broke, and then I called 911, or my husband was there, or my wife was there, or whatever. When people have been through that experience, they nod their heads like, yeah, I get it. That's also true of grievers, right? Grievers have the like, how did they hear the information? How did they take in the information? What was their then next experience? All of those things, both birth and grief, there's trauma. There's an overwhelm to the system. People, tell funny stories about like, I ate out of the dog food can. Like I didn't understand, drove the wrong way to get to the hospital. All of that is because your brain is overwhelmed in a certain way. For people who are traumatized, that does not lessen, and in fact can get worse. So with my dad's death, which was in 2017, he was diagnosed in 2016 with small cell cancer, which is more often known as lung cancer or prostate cancer, but his didn't have an origin. So we just knew it as this, type of cancer that multiplies really quickly and is pretty lethal. And I would tell you that I think the part of his death that was the most traumatizing, meaning I continued to struggle and I was making meaning out of it, was that I have 5 brothers and sisters and my mom and dad, and there was sort of varying degrees of ability to accept his diagnosis. I had a very, I work in the medical field. I, took what I knew of his diagnosis, took it to a colleague. I didn't actually tell the colleague I was talking about my dad, but I did say, what can you tell me about this? And he was like, that guy's going to die in a year. And so, it was like super overwhelming. I had a trauma response. Like I got dizzy. I had to walk around outside. I actually went to a bar and like did a shot, because if you're not an alcoholic, alcohol can help regulate your system. It can help down regulate your system really fast. I was also at work, so I had clients that I was going to have to. But then I knew, like I was never confused really ever again. And if I did get confused, I would call this colleague and he would be like, nope. I mean, I eventually told him the truth, like, this is my dad, but I still want you to be frank with me. And he was, and it was really helpful. And so, pretty much from jump, I knew my dad had a year, tops. And he did die actually a year and like 6 days to the diagnosis. And so I participated. He was in Massachusetts. I was in DC. I sat down with my husband and was like, I have a complicated relationship with my dad. I want to just at least be able to show up. I just want to sit with him and let him know he's loved and cared about. And I got to do that. I mean, it was a little more difficult in the beginning in the sense that my mom was a pretty private person and she was pretty protective of my dad's like energy. But as he got more ill, there was a period of time, he died in June and around Mother's Day. So in May, he got really sick really fast when I was visiting. And so I was much more involved in sort of helping navigate some of his care, some of the choices around his care. But once he was sort of hospitalized, I would just come up on the weekends and sit with him, and he would talk about his funeral. He would talk about regrets he had. I still have all of his contacts that we transferred into my phone because there were people. It started that there were a few people that he wanted me to call to tell personally that he had died. And then it was basically like everyone that he knew. He wanted me to call them personally. And at the time, I really wanted to do what he wanted. And so I agreed to all that, really not thinking like, what would it be like to make, 85 phone calls to people who are just learning that my dad died. So, there are elements to that where I'm really grateful for the time that we had, and elements to it where it's like, it doesn't matter how much great knowledge you have and how much therapy you've had, you're still going to have these experiences where you look back and think, what was I thinking? Why did I do that? What was the point of that? So my experience with my dad was really beautiful in a lot of ways. I mean, like I said, we had a pretty complicated relationship, and we had a year of a lot of peace between us. And I'm really grateful for that. I mean, I still have regrets about his death, and his death was still really difficult. But if you look at what grief is meant to do, which is sort of, it is meant to lessen over time in terms of the amount of distress, and you begin to integrate that this person isn't a part of my life anymore, and you begin to sort of have a relationship with the memory of them. If you think of that as sort of like the natural progression that we're working for, I use typical talk therapy. I went to a grief retreat, and it all worked. It was successful. It was a success case. I felt better. I still have times where I miss my dad and where I feel sad, but it was pretty straightforward, if that makes sense.
And so that was just in a couple years' time that you did all of these things. And so I was kind of smiling a little bit because you said that, all of these things worked for you and it was successful. And I guess that's kind of astounding for me or great for you, actually, that in that small amount of time, those things that you were able to say it worked for you. And I don't know if that means, did it subside a little bit, as you said?
Yeah, no, I think one of the things that's important, we're really careful, this, we're really careful not to sort of compare people's experiences. It's important that, like, my dad was not an active part of my life on a regular basis. And that's reflective in the degree to which I felt pain in the loss of him. I went to boarding school, I went to college. As soon as I could be free of needing him, I figured out how to do that. So anything, like by my mid-20s, any relationship that I had with my dad was really just based on a desire to have him there. So for people who go through the experience of losing their parents when they still need them as parents, it's a completely different experience. I mean, my husband and I have been together about 20 years, and at the time, it'd be interesting if my husband was here to hear what he would say. But at the time that he met me, my relationship with my dad was not great. And it was even a little iffy with my mom. And I think that's kind of reflective of being young in your 20s and you're trying to like leave their nest to build your own nest. And there's some anger and frustration around there. But my husband was able to show up in my life and just appreciate my dad for the good stories that he had and the way in which he is was a really smart person without all of the, I wish he could have been X, Y, and Z to me when I was a kid that I was carrying around. And so we would talk about it. In the early days, it almost felt like a betrayal that he liked my dad so much. Like, how can you like this man so much? He was so hard for me when I was a kid. And when I say my dad was hard, my dad was a really big man in his world, and having children was not, I think he really loved us in that John F. Kennedy kind of way, like big Irish Catholic family, like tumbling around on the lawn. But most of my childhood, he had a job that was away from where my family lived. So he and my mom were together. They were married, but he would go for the week and come back on the weekend. And it's hard to have a parent who's like a visitor. So even though my parents weren't divorced, it had that component to it, which was sort of, he would come in and the weekend would then feel different. So yes, I did traditional therapy. I was able to work through some of that in a short period of time, but and I mean no disrespect to my dad in this way, but it's literally, reflective of what our relationship was, which was I didn't really need him for anything. He was around and I was in his life because we wanted each other there. And honestly, kind of the price of being in my dad's life was he had to be the focus. And so he didn't know me that well. He didn't understand my work that well. I think he loved me as well as he could, but my reliance on him, I have 2 older brothers. If I needed good advice, that's who I called, not my dad. And actually, honestly, my dad knew that. He understood that. So I think the degree to which there was pain and it was hard to recover from is reflective in, if we were going to say, like, if you were going to make orbits of relationships, his would be a wide orbit. He would be out in the distance, not super close, which is the opposite of my mom. My mom was someone who I spoke to every day, every day, sometimes twice a day, since I lived outside of the home.
Good. And thank you for that distinction. We're definitely all different, and our grief and our trauma experiences are different as well.
Well, and I think one of the things that we do, right? Like, I know this, I write a bit about this, that, we hear somebody else's story and we're like, why isn't it that way for me? And I think one of the important things in grief and loss is to understand that, like, your relationship and what you have lost is literally unique to you. There is no comparison to it because, even if you have a twin sister who, every experience is the same, you still lose your parent all by yourself. It is your loss. And so my telling a story of, my dad died not that long ago and I'm kind of okay with it does not mean I have done anything better or that I have any secrets that somebody else could employ because, I seem to be okay with the loss of my dad. I treat clients and have a lot, I'm still integrating the loss of my mom, which is, I guess my dad was more like 3 years ago. My mom was 18 months ago. It's hard for me to see a world where I'm not going to feel the just concrete gripping loss of her all the time. I believe it's possible because I have seen people go through profound loss and have that abate after a while, but it hasn't happened. I'm still integrating it. We're still working on it. Well, let me say one more thing about my dad. When my dad died, which I think is important, but partly as a clinician and just as a person, when I said to my husband, I want to go up on the weekends and I want to see my dad, that was a big ask. We have 3 kids, we have a life, we have businesses. But what I said to him was, I just don't want to regret anything. When he dies, I don't want to have any regrets. And I was barely there the day that my dad died. The universe sort of configured itself in this crazy way, even though I had flown back and forth like 10 times. The very last time that I flew up there, it was like I got a speeding ticket and the parking lot was full and I couldn't fly to that airport. I had to fly to a different airport. It was like something out of a bad movie. So I barely made it there, and he died. And there is, anyone who's been a participant in a death knows that there's a whole process that, there's a hospice worker there. They make phone calls. The funeral company comes, the funeral home. So they had just taken my father's body away. And one of my very, very first thought, he was literally like being driven down our driveway. And my very first thought was of this, hour-long period where he had been taken away to have a minor surgery and I was in the hospital. And so I went somewhere to get a sandwich. And I came back and discovered that he was still there sitting in this hallway, that someone had come in more emergent than he was. And so his surgery got bumped. And in the moment, I was sort of like, bummer. If I'd known that, I would have sat here and kept him company. And in the moment after my father died, that was the thought I had, was why didn't I sit there with him then? And it was just, I mean, I remember, it even makes me warm when I think about it now. I just remember the intensity of like, oh, regret is the human experience in grief. Like, you don't get to go around it. There is no way that you aren't going to feel, as part of your loss, these moments that you wish could have been different because you don't get any more moments. And so it was just this incredible, like, wow, that is such a learning and a knowing for me, that even though I've been a clinician all these years, that was the first time that I was like, oh, I need to let people know this. It doesn't go down different. You will regret. And I find that really like peaceful. And there's another thing that people talk about a lot, which was much more an issue when my mom died. You know, if you do any reading about grief, if you're on any grief boards, which, you know, both of us are, people talk about these friendships and relationships that shift and change, and that people who have been there for them their whole lives are no longer able to show up in any kind of good or meaningful way, or they're making everything worse. And that is also a truism in grief. Just like when you have when you have a baby, like there are some people who can't handle that, or can't show up for that, or don't want to be a part of that, or believe that you're totally different than them. Or when you move jobs, you know, you had these people that were in your life and you felt close to them and they were important to you, but like, you know, now you work down the street and you don't see each other anymore. That is also a truism in grief, which is like, yep, you're going to lose some relationships. And it's probably not because of anybody. There's probably no bad actors here. Like, it sucks that when you're the griever and you're in pain, that you get more pain because you're learning that these relationships are not going to hold. But with my clinical work, part of what I use is this word yield, which is like, if you just yield to the truth of that, if you just let it be and go in front of you and you follow that truth, there's less pain. And so I talk a lot about, I have a big yield sign in my office. And I talk a lot about like, what if we just yielded to this? What if we just let this energy go in front of us and we trailed behind it? That we have loved this friend forever. We are new and different now. We don't have a mom. We don't have a dad. And they cannot show up for this. Maybe they'll show up, maybe in a year, but maybe also not. And if we could figure out a way to not hate them or ourselves and just do the work of the grief and say, this is as it is, the energy kind of stays with us, which is where we need it to stay. You know, we have to show up for ourselves in grief every damn day until it's done. And so to pivot a little bit towards my mom, I mean, that really was the phrase I used a lot with my mom was, you know, I just didn't know how or who to be anymore. She was such a tether in my life. And her death was really tough. I had my husband's English, and he had taken our 3 kids for the first time to England, and I didn't go, which I was like, I know that sounds bad, but you know, we've been together 20 years. There's 2 or 3 trips to England. And England is amazing, but it's also a bit like going to see your in-laws in New Jersey. It's like, so I called my mom and I was like, I'm not going to go. Do you want to do something? And she had been, you know, it was a huge adjustment for her without my dad. And one of the things that she had said to me that made me really sad was, you know, I'm probably never going to travel again. And I think what she was referencing was the way that they traveled. His executive life was really amazing. And she wasn't going to make those kind of travel plans for herself. So I called her and said, you and I can go somewhere. I'll be the travel agent. And I think partly because she had some really minor health stuff going on, she didn't want to do anything like dramatic, but we decided we would go to Maine, not far from where my youngest brother lives. And we did. And the week before, my older sister who lives in Seattle called and said, you know, Mom's not feeling great. And so I called her and was like, you can cancel this trip. Like, we can do this anytime. And she didn't cancel. And when we were because she really wanted to go, and when we were in Maine, it was clear she wasn't totally well. She had a terrible stomach ache. She didn't eat very much when we were there. So she and I spent that time together, and it was this weird, like, foreboding, experience where we were laughing. She had one really bad night and we were laughing about like how I had gotten up to go running. And when I came in, I was like, is she awake? Is she not awake? And we made this joke about like, oh my God, wouldn't it have been crazy if the chambermaid came in and my mom had died and the chambermaid had found her. And then it could be like a murder she wrote in Maine, a really bizarre sort of morbid foreboding element. But she drove back to Cape Cod where she lives. I came back to DC. The kids came home and then we got in the car and drove back to her house because my family normally spends 2 to 3 weeks, maybe a month with her in Cape Cod for the summer. That's like my kids' summer break. And I was going to wait, but I was like, she wasn't feeling well. I'll get back in the car. So we got back, we drove up to her and she really she didn't look great. And she kept saying, I don't know what it is. I have a stomach bug. She had gone to her doctor. The doctor said it was a stomach bug. Ultimately, I ended up taking her to the emergency room. They did lots of tests. They didn't find anything. And then, 5 days after the emergency room, she died in her sleep. And so it's not that we didn't know anything, but somebody having a stomach bug and, dying are not the same things. And part of what was so there's the element of like, the immediate thoughts after she died. I mean, the immediate thought I had when my husband told me that she had died was that it was my fault and that I still struggle with that most days, either when I wake up or when I go to bed at night. That little haunted house thought is in my brain. And the way that I think about that, the way that I know, the reason that I know that that thought is there is that it is easier for me to go down the rabbit hole of blaming myself and trying to figure out what I could have done differently to keep her from dying than do the hard thing that I have to do every day, which is live without her. I would rather feel like I have some agency in blaming myself than the hopelessness and the like reinventing of the life before me, which exists without her. So I've come to sort of tolerate the thought, and I tell my husband about it a lot because people don't know to ask you. So are you, blaming yourself today? Especially not if you put mascara on. They don't think, they think you look fine. So I say to him like, oh, that thought's been really terrible. Today, I've really had, I've thought about it dozens of times, and it in and of itself is a form of PTSD. Post-traumatic stress disorder has these features of just repetition that get triggered, where you in your body experience a sense of, terror or hopelessness. And so I have that. And even though I've had lots of treatment for it, it still exists. It's still part of my, and maybe it will be. I mean, I'm trying to make room for the fact that there's a possibility that I will always feel, the loss of her through that thought, which is I should have done something differently. But part of the other element of the trauma with my mom is that I did actually, when we woke up in the morning, we were driving into Boston, which is about an hour from my mom's house, to pick up my best friend's son. And as we were leaving the house, I had a really odd feeling inside my body. And we drove to my best friend's house about an hour and 15 minutes away. And my kids ran upstairs to get, they call her son their cousin. And as they were running upstairs, I had this sensation of like water breaking. Like I felt this huge rush through the core of my body. I mean, so much so that I looked down at my legs expecting to have see wetness. I was not pregnant. And then I had an absolute clear thought, which is she died. Actually, she's dead. So I picked up my phone. I was just, sitting in the car. I picked up my phone and called my husband, who was working at my mom's house working. And I said, have you seen her? And he was like, no, it's weird. I haven't seen her because she's a really early riser the same way I am. And I told him to go into her room. I was like, I think she died. And he went in and she did die. So that sensory, trauma is something that's really held inside the body, your five senses. So when you talk to people, they'll tell you that they have something that they saw that flashes through them. the last moments, the pictures, that traumatic element is true for a lot of grievers, that they have something that they rotate as a movie in their mind every day. And that in and of itself is okay. For a lot of people, that resolves on its own. When it's traumatic, meaning it's kind of stuck in your system and it's going to make you sick or not better, it gets worse. And so those images, that sensation in my body, the images and the thoughts just got worse. So I went from sort of thinking about them or processing them a couple of times a day to not being able to stop processing them, to only doing that all day long, sitting on my porch swing and only having those thoughts, which again, if you had met anyone who was around me at the time, they would tell you I seemed like I was doing pretty well because I was working very hard to seem like I was doing pretty well. And so that after I learned that my mom had died, I had these kids in the car. I had pulled, my husband was like, you need to pull over for me to tell you this. And I was like, I already know. And I had 4 kids in the car, like idling in my minivan. And I was in this crazy parking lot in the middle of like nowhere, suburb of Boston. And he said she had died. And for whatever reason, I felt like at that exact moment, I had to call each one of my siblings and tell them that this had happened. Like I felt so acutely like alone, like existentially, that I really felt like I needed to tell them. And I have some regret about that too, because I wish that I had been able to convey the information just more carefully to them. I'm a trauma therapist. Like I think about these things all day, and I just wish I could have, I have all of my siblings' partners' phone numbers. I could have called my brother's wife and said, I need you to find him and tell him this terrible thing. I didn't have that part of my brain online. Your brain goes through its own processes in those moments. So then I had to drive an hour and 15 minutes to get back to my mom, which I did do. And she was really religious. And so I sat with her body and made an effort to pray in the way that was important to her. She really loved the rosary. And I was raised with the rosary, but I could not remember. I can't remember because I'm out of practice, and I couldn't remember because my brain was just so crazy at the moment. So when afterwards, after all the stuff that happens when you have to bury someone or go through the process of deciding how to go through a funeral and all of those things, because this was before COVID, we could have a real funeral. When all of that was done, the PTSD, the real trauma, was the sensation of knowing in my body that she had died, the desperation to get back to her, the sitting with her body and not being able to show up with the prayers, perfectly or even actually genuinely. I'm not a religious person, and she was. And so I sat in that loop of just, those painful ideas, those painful thoughts for a really long time, about a month. And then, as often happens, I had a somatic response, meaning my body sort of gave out. I threw my back out. I've had back problems, meaning when I'm running myself wrong, my back is like, I'm going to put you flat on your back and now you can't run. My back went out really significantly. To the point that I couldn't get up to use the bathroom. I was in the basement. I couldn't get up the stairs. And I called a colleague and was like, Uncle, I can't do this life this way. And she, God love her, was like, watch this really bad movie on Netflix and I'll call you in an hour with a plan. And she did. She called me in an hour with a plan. And the plan was to send me to the exact same facility I send my clients to when they have, all the symptoms and experiences that I was having, which was pretty humbling. Humbling and amazing. It's an amazing thing to be a consumer, to need the exact same things that your clients have needed. So when I got to the facility, they were like, oh, your name is associated with these 15 people. Would you like me to send your records? And I was like, no, those are my clients. Please don't send them my records.
Was it difficult for you to realize that you, as this was your career and you're in it, so you weren't able to, oftentimes I find, I know some behavior techniques and things. So when I'm in something, I'm like, I know everything on how to get out of this. but I can't do it.
Yeah.
And so was that like hard for you to realize?
Yeah. That's a great question. I don't know that I'd be a great report right now, because what I know was, this may not be a good answer to your question, but let me say this. So I have a good friend who lives, right couple houses down, and pretty much every day she would say, let's go to lunch. Let me take you to lunch. And I would say, yeah, that sounds great. Let's do that. And I already knew that I was going to cancel that lunch. I already knew that I was not going to be able to any of the things, like get dressed, navigate. A lot of what happens when you're in that early fresh grief is your system is so overwhelmed. I always describe it as like you're walking around wet. Like I can't sit and have lunch when I'm soaking wet. Like everything is so uncomfortable. Like a little breeze makes me too cold when I'm wet. So I was already navigating and did know, like, I am showing up in a way that makes people think I can go to lunch. And my internal experience is I can barely get to the bathroom. So, my siblings were really worried about me. And which is interesting because I'm not usually the one in the family that everybody worries about. So I think it probably showed outwardly more than I was aware of, right? But I don't know how aware I really was in terms of like there's a type of therapy called EMDR, which you might be familiar with, which is a bilateral stimulation that you do with your eyes. It's really it's like magic. This woman named Francine Rains invented it for herself, which is if you move your eyes from left to right in a certain kind of format, it allows memories to move across your brain through bilateral stimulation. So for people who have really terrible, memories, flashes of memories, things that are looping in their brain, this kind of therapy is unbelievable. It's like magic. In fact, when I got trained in it, I had a memory of a death event that happened from my childhood that had always existed. Like I could run the tape, I could have scripted the movie and cast it and all of it and directed it. And just with one EMDR session, it went from being, kind of like a very bold pen and ink drawing to kind of a watercolor, experience. So the memory's still there. It's just the intensity at which I experience it is completely different. So I already knew it would be a good thing for me to have EMDR. The person that does EMDR with me was on vacation because it was the end of the summer. And I didn't tell her it was urgent. I was like, no, I think I'm okay, even though I knew I wasn't okay. And B, I didn't look anywhere else for treatment, I think because it was too hard. So I think I did really know that I was not okay. I think I did really know that, that when I'm looking at my clients and saying this is not more than they can handle, that I would have looked at myself and been like, this woman needs more support and help. How are we going to get it? But I also at the same time had a whole nother part that was completely minimizing all of my symptoms and was also saying it was okay. So I think you can have both, right? Like a part of you that really does know that you're not all right. And a part of you that's like, it's not that big a deal. This happens to people all the time. This will right itself. And honestly, the part of me that throws her back out, that's the most reliable part. That's the part that's like, I told you I was, I'm pulling this car over like that. My back, when it goes out, I am literally debilitated in pain and usually then end up sedated, on strong painkillers to unlock the muscles. So in some ways, I think I didn't really understand how sick I had gotten. And my back was like the parent that came in and was like, we need to do this differently immediately.
So this is like a small, tiny detail, but I have to ask how you were in the basement. You couldn't get up the stairs. How did you get out?
So here's what happened. And this happened to me twice. We did call EMTs and with the intention, like the EMTs would carry me up the stairs. but I was terrified of the idea of them putting their hands on me. So I was probably down there for like a full day when I called my colleague Susan and said, I need to not be driving the bus of how these decisions get made, because I'm not making good decisions. And she was like, I got it. I'm going to take care of this. And actually I had several colleagues who were just instrumental in other colleagues who were like, yep, you're stepping away from your practice for 6 months. There's no way I would have thought that I could do that. And they were emphatic and they were right. I mean, I even coming back at 6 months was hard. So when I talked to the intake coordinator, who was actually someone that I knew at the facility, which is a place called Milestones at Onsite at a ranch in Tennessee, an incredible program, it unlocked almost immediately. My back went from being like an accordion to it just went away. And I've had that happen more than once. That when I went to treat, I have always said like, oh, when I'm stressed, my back goes out. And what the practitioners and treatment said is this is a grief response. That when your back goes out, it's because of unprocessed grief. And I'm very body centered. So there's a lot of like Chinese medicine that will map, where tension is and anger, and where you might have symptoms if you were sexually abused as a child, or if you were raised by, unloving parents. There's all these maps of the body, and the lower back, it turns out that many people map it as grief. And I just sort of had never taken that in and never noticed that before. So after I spoke to the intake coordinator, about 30 minutes later, I could stand up, which is lucky, because I spent a whole more than 24 hours down there, which, you can imagine it's complicated. Like, how do you use the bathroom? Yeah, it's not good. Those answers are not good answers.
I won't ask them.
Yeah, you don't want to know.
You've said so many good things right now, and I think this is so many things that people just need to hear.
One thing that also I was thinking about telling you about is, when my dad died, I couldn't read for about, a year after my dad died. And then all of a sudden I just could. Like, my husband gave me a book of a author that I really like, and I picked it up and I read all the way through. But what had been happening was I just couldn't concentrate that well. But I found talk therapy, just general, how are you doing? Just a really great hour to myself of talking about my dad in whatever, I didn't have to change my language or worry that someone was going to be offended or worry that I was, they were going to worry about me. The typical talk therapy with my therapist, who I've known for a long time, was really great. When my mom died, talk therapy was like a problem because I was so untethered. My attachment to her was such a part of my definition of myself. The way that I describe it is like, she was a tent pole. And so, she was at the center, and then all the little parts of the tent are attached in a circle. And so when that goes down, I don't even know I couldn't even tell you. And so the phrase I kept saying was I don't even know who I am. So when I went to, talk therapy and somebody said, how are you feeling? I was like, I don't know how I'm feeling. I don't get any of anything right now. Nothing makes any sense. And to have somebody validate that you don't make any sense to yourself is really existential French poetry bad. That is not helpful for you. If you say to me, Meghan, how are you doing? And then in typical talk therapy, you're going to validate and say, that makes sense to me, that you're really confused. That's a bad hour of therapy. So what happened, because all that is sort of saying oh, I think it's going to rain. Do you think it's going to rain? I saw in the news that it might rain. What will we do if it rains? That doesn't so that actually made me more anxious, and it made me feel much more alone and isolated. And at the same time, I was watching other people that I cared about, go back to their lives. And so right around, it was about, my mom died in August. At Christmas time, I went to see my in-laws in England to spend Christmas there. And I had this experience that I have heard so many people describe, which is like, even though they had sent flowers, many people in England had been really, just incredibly kind and generous and showed up and cared. This was the first time I had seen them physically. And so it's almost like when you see little kids and they've grown, like you're like, oh my God, you've grown. Look at you. You're so tall. I expected people to be like, oh my God, you're so completely different. But everyone was like, hey, how are you? Would you like a cup of tea? There wasn't any like strong response to take me into my life shattering event. And even though it wasn't like, nobody was like gaslighting me, it made me feel super crazy when I got there. It was like a major holiday. I was there without either of my parents alive, trying to navigate this. And everyone, I mean, honestly, rightfully so, was, I think, just moving forward with the holiday. And everything made me crazy and hurt. And I had this one moment where, when I had taken my mom to the hospital, my mom was tiny. She was like 5 feet and she was always cold my entire childhood. That was like the story of her life, was that she was like, where's her sweater and where are her socks? So I worked as an ER psych practitioner for a while. And I know that emergency rooms and hospitals are like refrigerators. So when I was taking her to the hospital before she died, the week before she died, I threw like sweaters and socks and stuff in my bag, and we went to the hospital. And when we got there, she wasn't feeling well and she was irritable. And so she didn't have, I said to her, do you want a sweater? And she was like, no, leave me alone. And then they hung an IV and she started to feel better. And she was like, oh my God, I'm freezing. I'll take the sweater and the socks. And I was like, of course. So I reach into my bag and I have her tiny little sweater and I give her sweater. And I'm like, oh shit, I don't have the socks. Like I offered her the socks and they must have fallen out in the car. So I slip off my running sneakers and I slip off my socks like real surreptitiously. And I come over and I put them on her feet. And we're sitting there and she's like, hey, can I ask you a question? And I'm like, yeah. She's like, are these your socks from your own feet? And I'm like, yes. And my mom had just like an amazing sense of humor and an amazing sense of timing. And she just loved to laugh. And she's like, can I ask you another question? And I'm like, yeah. And my socks are like those little Under Armour socks that have the little swoosh on them from the Under Armour. And one of them was like pink and one was purple and something like that. And she's like, how come young people don't give a shit whether or not their socks match? I mean, it's infuriating. And I was like, lady, just shut up and say thank you for the socks, And that story to me is this beautiful, like it's almost biblical, like this moment where like I really just tended to her by giving her like the socks off my feet. And it was so my mom in this really humorous moment, but I'm so grateful for it. Like I'm so grateful that is a story that I get to hold on to. And when I was in England, I was really, really struggling, I think it was right after Christmas. I think I tried to call some siblings and they didn't pick up or something. And I looked down and I had running socks on with 2 different swooshes on them. And it was just, carnage, right? Like I was just beside myself in this bathroom. Everybody else is downstairs, like watching a James Bond movie. And I just had one of those big, huge grief moments where I remembered the story. I remembered how sweet the story was. I remembered her sense of humor. And I just couldn't believe that I had these socks on. So I really wanted to tell someone immediately, this is what is happening to me right now. So I did what I never had done before. When I worked as a therapist, in DC primarily, I had clients for whom it was better that I not have any internet presence, so that if they were seen coming into my office, nobody's going to write in the Washington Post like, oh, this person's going to see a therapist. So I had no internet presence. I barely had a Facebook thing. I had like 3 friends on Instagram. I didn't know how to navigate it, but I went on Facebook and just said that story that I told you right now in like 8 lines, like, here are my socks. This is what happened. And because I don't really understand Facebook, I didn't know that I was putting that out publicly. I thought I was like just saying it to my 9 friends, but people shared the story. And, I think it was Christmas. I wasn't the only person that was experiencing loss. And all of a sudden I'm hearing from like, my best friend's friend from when they were in brownies together in 2nd grade. And that Christmas was really full of people sharing their love for their lost parent with me on account of me telling the story publicly. And so that was the shift into writing, and actually writing for an audience. It's interesting. I did a podcast recently with writers, and one of the people there was like, don't put your podcast up for public consumption. I mean, your blog up for public consumption, just write it for yourself. And I was like, actually, I don't think so. Like, I think with grief, we actually need validation, and we can validate each other in a way that, it's like we all are native Portuguese speakers. It's like we can laugh about this thing in a way that, somebody who doesn't understand the language, they're not going to get it till they get it. So I really felt like the writing and putting these small vignettes on Instagram, initially it was just on Facebook, and every single time I did, I would mostly get a private message from someone, but sometimes it was public, just like, this is why this story mattered to me. This is why it was relevant. This is what it meant to me. And it was just it was incredibly personally affirming for me. It made me feel better. And I think it made other people feel better. And so then I came home, and there's also there's the therapeutic element of writing, which is why I hold this writing workshop, because I think you come to know yourself better and how you feel better when you try to put some words around it. Even if it's terrible, it's kind of like dancing. It doesn't matter. You don't need to be an Alvin Ailey. Like, the process of being in your body with that kind of energy is important. And I think the process of trying to find the right words for yourself so that you understand yourself is amazing. And for some people, the host of then taking that, publishing it, having other people affirm it and say, that was really meaningful and that was really helpful to me. And for me, the writing is this blend of like my personal experiences and then all this stuff that I concretely have learned for, 2 decades in therapy. And then the way in which like they sort of either became true for me or, there are some things that I don't think are true. There's some things, there's a person who writes about grief out there. And one of her tenets in her book is like, no matter what happens, if someone's talking about their grief, do not talk about your own. And I just think that's not right. I just think I think her fear, which is that you can sort of hijack someone else's and pile on and take away from their story, is something to be aware of. But I also know just as many people who were like, and then my friend said, me too, I felt that way when my dad died. And, my whole system unlocked and I felt seen and known and I could relax. So it's an interesting blend for me of like the things that I know that are true and the art of coming to know myself.
Yeah. So I was exploring your blog, Grief is My Side Hustle.
Yeah.
And what I think I liked about your writing is that you're able to put these feelings into words. And I mean, and some of the things you say are really thought-provoking, I think. And so, and we've talked about, grief informed, and we'll get into all of that. But I just think definitely I would be so sad if you weren't sharing your writing.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I mean, right now there's more of it out there than I ever would have expected or anticipated. But I sort of feel like there's no going back for me now. Like I'm actually not in talk therapy right now. I'm only doing, I have my pages, I get up, I write them. Sometimes they end up on a blog or somewhere else because I feel like, yeah, this is good writing. Other times I look back and I'm like, what was I, sometimes I sound like, I don't even know what, like old Elizabethan English, the tone is crazy, but it's just for me. But either way, it's kind of like getting up and going running, it's just a practice that gives me relief.
And so let's talk about just a tiny bit about your writing group now. So is there going to be an opportunity coming up for anybody interested to join a group like this?
Yeah. So actually the stuff is up right now on my Instagram and so my Instagram is Meghan Riordan Jarvis and my writer's page is Grief is My Side Hustle. And there is a website, which is also Grief is My Side Hustle, all one word. And right on there, the writing group Grief Mates, we're starting a new group right now. So I had been running Grief Mates in a small, some with clients, some with, clergy that I knew that needed some grief work. So it was a small group that was just an email based group. And then I got like a whole bunch of people all at once in November who were like, hey, can we join? And I was like, you can join, but I'm going to have to move. I'm going to have to figure the technology on this out. And then I was on a podcast and they advertised it. And then somebody pasted it on a grief and loss board. And it went from being like 20 people to 150 people. And then I was like, okay, I can't do more than that. I need to try this in a new format for 150 people. So I put everybody else in the waiting room, and then the waiting room started to get more and more full. And I was like, all right, so we have another group that starts February 8th. And the format is that you get a prompt Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And the prompts are therapeutic prompts. So they're not random. They build off each other. I generally mix them up a little bit. Like if I notice that people in the comment section are suddenly now talking about spirituality, then I'll, move the prompt that I was going to do 2 weeks from now and put it now, So it tends to build, and you're allowed, you can share your writing or do it privately. I am talking to a publisher right now about trying to put it in a workbook form so that people who don't want to be on a Facebook group or don't. And I hired a little team of techie people because I can't do any of that stuff, mostly to meet capacity. And I'll tell you, so my family, my kids and I, my husband, not the dog, we left the dog home, did this amazing trip where we went to 28 national parks and monuments and 21 states we started in mid-August and we did it through mid-December. And so it was this like amazing way to sort of ride out COVID and be doing internet schooling. But it was also, like those Australian walkabouts where I was every day really doing a lot of grief and loss practice for myself. And so every city that we went to, every town that we went to, we ended up, our last base camp was in Taos, New Mexico, which is a really deeply spiritual area of the country that just smells amazing and looks amazing. New Mexico had already sort of closed itself down because it has an ancient pueblo. It has ancient pueblos in it. So, and a very responsible governor. So there wasn't a lot for us to do there. So we did a lot of like being outside and hiking, and they have a gorgeous labyrinth, a walking labyrinth. And I love those. I'm obsessed with them. So I went to one and I was really struggling with this writers group. Like, how am I going to do this? How am I going to serve these people with intention and show up the way that I want to show up, and also do my practice, and also, because I'm still seeing clients, and also do the work. And at the time I was trying to think like, how do I turn this into some sort of, because for the first couple of writers groups, I charged a fee, a small fee, but I charged a fee. And I was walking in this labyrinth and I just had this thought of like, let go of the money. And so then when I understood that it could just be literally a free offering, it became this like, oh my God, this is just a passion project. This is a gift that I'm giving to people. And that's what it's become. And now I just love it. It doesn't stress me out. I look at it as something that I'm more a participant and a guide in than I am. Where I went to high school, we learned, our classes were around a round table and it was a discussion. And so it was, no one here is better than the other. Some may have more information. And that's how I think about the writing group, which is, there have been some beautiful pieces of writing that have come out of it. There have been some totally thought-provoking pieces that I haven't heard in my 20 years before. And it looks as though, a small group of people are doing the class because there's a small group of people that are sharing. But, the way technology works, I can see how people are consuming it. And I get a lot of private messages. And so I know it's been really meaningful to people. And honestly, I'm not surprised by that, because I do not think, you said the phrase grief informed a minute ago. Like I am boggled that we do not have classes on grief in college that are mandatory. I am completely stunned that over and over and over again, if we put a bunch of fresh grievers in the room, every one of them is going to think what they're going through is totally abnormal. And we in the field we know it's not. that when you can't sleep, that is totally normal. And I give a little lecture about the brain science about why you can't sleep. To me, it's really frustrating that we haven't communicated the things that we know about grief and about yes, you know what, it's all individual. Everybody has to get through it in their own way. But, you know, and this is the analogy I always use, but like my daughter, when she was 11, she took a class on puberty. Puberty is really, you know, you're going to get your boobs when you're 12. I don't get mine until I'm 20, but we all have to know about what that process is in our body. And grief, I think, is really similar, which is, you know, we're all going to go through this. Hopefully, lots of us won't have any real profound loss until much later in our lives, but that is not the statistical, you know, reality for the world. And with COVID, there are literally over 3 million people who are grieving a concrete loss. Someone in their life died just in this country, never mind the rest of the world. And we still don't have resources. And I could get up on a soapbox for hours, but that is obscene to me. It's obscene to me that we do not have a whole bunch of people out there who can say to you, this is normal. This is the way this works. You know, I remember reading a book when I was pregnant with my daughter. And I think it was What to Expect When You're Expecting. And there's like one page where it's like, are your gums bleeding? Do you have like flaky skin on your eyebrows? Like, are you thirsty all the time? Does your pee smell funny? Like whatever. I was like, yes. And it was like, these are all because of pregnancy. Do you have a weird stripe around your stomach? And I was like, what? All of that to me, like we have no problem providing that kind of support to women because we think babies are awesome and we think having families are awesome, but they are super traumatizing. Adding a demanding, tiny creature to your marriage and your family is really, really hard. And we offer a lot of support. Like when I had my first kid, there was a class at the local Jewish community center that I could walk to and talk to other moms. Mostly what we did was cry about how hard it was. If you want to go and have a grief and loss experience with other people, you know, part of what you need to be able to do is find the right people. Did you lose a parent? Did you lose a close parent? Did you lose a child? You know, did you lose someone to COVID? There needs to be more people out there doing talking for you to kind of step in and say, this is a good group for me to like unbutton my pants and just sort of hang out and share my experience and hear other people's experiences. And I am just wildly stunned that in this day and age, we don't have, and there are really wonderful programs. There's a documentary called What's Your Grief? I don't know if you know it. It's from, the director's name is Lindsay Thistle-Wenton. And I think I'm saying her name wrong, but it's from Penn State and it's funded by a bunch of philanthropic organizations. And it's intended to do exactly what we're talking about, which is present these, I think it's 7 families who have different kinds of loss and just sort of normalize this is the way that this happens. And part of the reason I think it's incredibly important for people to understand that like grief is actually a normal thing. It's incredibly difficult. It usually resolves on its own, meaning resolve, not you go back to who you were. I mean, I'm never going to go back to a person who isn't a parent. No one is saying to me, are you back to yourself now that you've had kids? You know, I am a parent for the rest of my life. I will be a griever the rest of my life. There's an element in there that, we don't support it, but we could support it. I mean, we could say to people like, I understand that you are now a griever. Fresh grief looks this way. You might grieve your dad again when he's not there at your wedding. That might feel more fresh, but we're going to integrate it, and you will come to an understanding with yourself about your loss. That is what natural grief looks like. Natural grief resolves. Our body knows how to resolve, and it takes as long as it takes. So if it takes me 18 months and it takes you 6 years, yes, we are both doing it perfectly. And when I say 6 years, I don't mean you're done grieving. You're never done grieving. You're a griever the rest of your life. I mean, the actual amount of effort that it takes to be a griever is more the same way that like the first time I go running, I might talk about that for the rest of the day. Oh, I ran 3 miles today. Oh, my legs hurt from running. If I'm running 3 miles a day for the rest of my life, I might not even mention it to you. You might be like, wow, I didn't even know you ran, because I've integrated that experience into my life now. And I understand it, and I understand myself to be a runner. That's what we're looking for in grief. However, as a trauma therapist, there's also a whole host of people that's not what's going to happen for them. They have early unresolved childhood trauma. This is tagging into other loss that has never been resolved. And so instead of it moving through and becoming part of who you are, it is a limiting belief that piles on to those other terrible experiences and reminds you that like the world is a terrible place and you probably shouldn't love people because they hurt you. And to some degree, the fact that I was traumatized with my mom's death, I had an early childhood death, a death of a beloved teen in my small town that, was back in the 80s, and we didn't talk to kids about that kind of stuff. And so I have a very acute memory of that experience and the confusion and the terror around like, why did a kid die? And what, is my brother going to die? And being very worried about that, and knowing that being worried about it was something I was going to have to handle on my own because we didn't talk about it. I know for a fact that unsupported experience contributed to how difficult it was for me when my mom died. I just know that those things are connected. I mean, I actually know the brain science around how we collect and create experiences. We cluster them together. So, there are people out there who are studying things like ACEs, which are, the adverse childhood experiences, the same way that we look at women who are having babies and we give them a screen for potential postpartum depression. We know that there are some things that are correlated, like you are more likely to have postpartum depression if you had depression. There's a lot of hormones going on, like you are more likely. And so we say to the mom, here are the things that you need to look for. I also think grief education is so important because like people who grew up in poverty, had divorced parents, had a brother who was killed, they are people that should be doing exercises, should know a lot about grief, and should be really well supported if something bad happens, because that is a person who's at high risk for trauma. And that kind of stuff, I feel like general population does not know that. And there's no reason they couldn't know. There's no reason they couldn't know.
So here's the question. How do we make them know? How do we help them know?
This is the big thing. Like a lot of what I am committed to, which is why I reached out to you on your podcast, is like, this is my soapbox. I'm going to talk about this anywhere I can. I'm reaching out to, I'm not a well-connected human, but all of the people that I think have a way of communicating that forward, bigger voices to understand it. And I'm writing a lot about it. So I have two different, one that's more of a memoir book. This is my experience around loss, as like we've talked about it. And then I have one that's more of a clinical book, both of which are, depending on my mood, I work on them, but they will find homes. There are people who are interested in putting those out there and publishing them. But it's not just me that's saying it. I mean, I think because of COVID, there are a number of people who are aware that we need to be upping our game in terms of, there's a wonderful podcast called Shapes of Grief in Ireland with a woman named Liz Gleason. And I've been a guest on her podcast before, and I'm working on a project with her, but she is like furiously putting together an international program on just grief education. Like, how do we become grief informed? The Dougie Center, which is the Center for Loss and Healing, it's primarily geared towards children and families, but they also just wrote a paper that's about becoming grief informed, how critically important it is that we become grief informed. And one of the things that I always say is, listen, like, in my childhood growing up, the idea of being transgendered would not even be, that is not something that conceptually I would have ever understood. The world that I grew up in, it was barely even introduced to me that people were gay, never mind like gender is a spectrum and sexuality is a spectrum. My children, like my 8-year-old, my 10-year-old, my 12-year-old, they can tell, they have words, they have language, they know more than the average bear, and they have no problem being like, well, what are your pronouns? I mean, they have learned this, as have, all the old ladies in my field who their signatures have their pronouns underneath them. So when we understand that, like, the reason we need to become grief informed is because the crap that people say right now causes harm and does damage. And it does. I mean, it does. When people say, oh, your mother's with Jesus, I need to go home and have a moment, because I don't believe that. And so someone saying that because it makes them feel better to my detriment, that shit shouldn't happen. Like, you shouldn't get to go home and say, oh, I really showed up for Meghan today because I talked to her mom about God. I talked to her about her mom and God, without knowing that that is something that I find comforting. So there's a lot of stuff that, like, we already know that. If you go on anyone's website who talks about grief, it says, do not say these things. And yet people say those things over and over and over. We say those things. And I feel like, similar to the understanding that, like, look, gender is not binary. It just isn't. We thought it was, or people thought it was, but now we're learning that it isn't. When you accidentally get the, oh, I said he and I should have said she, you say, I'm so sorry. I apologize. I'm still learning. This is new to me. When you say something terrible, like, well, at least you had your dad for 80 years or whatever, the crap that people say. And the griever is like, yeah, it doesn't make me feel better. Then there should be some understanding of, like, oh, this is my opportunity to figure out how to show up here better. But that isn't what happens. People go home and say, I was trying to be nice, and they were really ungrateful and told me that they didn't like what I said. And then there's that's not informed anything. I don't like how that person's grieving. I'm not going to call them again. They didn't tell, and so they're more isolated, and I don't feel any better. We can do better than that. We, honest to God, can do better. So yes, I'm writing about it. I'm talking about it. I'd like to get 5 minutes with Oprah and make her really care about this, because I am hoping, that somebody with a big voice will take on this. I would be surprised if it doesn't happen. You can't have 3 million new people grieving and not have a population that catches up with that as a sentiment.
Yeah. And you're already doing many things. You have your group, and you're talking out already. So someone else told me that, when you show up with your heart, then, everything is good. And that's one thing that I like about you, is I can tell that you are showing up with your heart, and you want to help people, and you want to get this information out. So I definitely appreciate that. And you're the first person that actually, for me, put it out there about the actual number of grievers that COVID has meant for us. And I was pretty astounded by that. We know that it's happening. We're hearing about it all the time.
The estimate is, I have been writing about this for a while, and I was estimating 8. And I read an article in the Atlantic, which estimated 9. So you take whatever the total is and multiply it by 9. And right now that's like 3.4 million people, which sounds right to me. I lost a friend who's my age. She's 46 years old. She had basically no symptoms. She woke up, she suddenly couldn't breathe. She went into cardiac arrest, and she died. And, I was thinking the other day, like, in my direct eyesight, in my direct experience, I know 4 people who died of COVID. So, that doesn't mean I'm going to mourn them all the same. My friend, her funeral is on Friday. I will mourn, but this is going to be an overlapping Venn diagram for all of us for a really long time. And I wrote a curriculum a while back. I think partly because after my mom died, the clinician in me, I read like 133 books on grief, and most of them I just like threw across the room. I was like, this is garbage. They don't know anything. And I have a commitment to myself, which is like, I don't talk garbage about people's good efforts, but I do try to, on my website, really highlight, who's doing good work and how they're doing good work. And I would challenge you, if you go to the names that you know of centers and places of people that do grief work and are known for doing grief work and look at their resource page, you are going to find only the things that they are involved in that are on their resource page. And I think that's part of when I said I was on that labyrinth and discovered, like, this is not about, I don't need this. I don't need to make money off my writing group. I have a totally full work life. It's certainly not about my ego. Like, if Oprah wanted to take everything that I ever wrote and say that she invented it herself, I'd be psyched about that. It is literally about getting people more support. And so I don't mind, I had a colleague yesterday who emailed me and said, hey, what book do you like about grief? And my response was, how old is the person? What's their gender? And who did they lose? Right? Because in my experience, the books that I like are not the books that someone my mother's age group would like. And so I want to make sure that we're giving, can we just cultivate it a little bit? So even though I might throw this book across the room because I'm like, oh, I hate the tenor of this book, I hate everything that they're saying, my mom would probably love that book. So the books that I gave my mom after my dad died were not books that I want to read. They were books that I thought she might want to read. And I find it really interesting, and I understand everybody needs to make money. There are 4 or 5 other grief writing workshops that are out there right now that are not wildly expensive, but are costly. And I am not even for 1 second challenging that those people are charging money for that. But they should. They've been in the field. They're working hard. They should get paid for their work, but there should be all kinds of public grants towards this work right now. There should be all kinds of money going towards people's efforts to put this out there. That, I'm in a position where it's fine for me to do because I don't need to add another piece of work to my work. This has become a passion project. But we need, everybody who has ever had anything to say about grief should get together and agree on some things, create a curriculum. That's what I started saying is I wrote this curriculum, and I have said to several places, if you want it, you can have it. I don't need to sell it to you. I certainly don't want to come and do it. Like, I don't want to stand on a stage and talk to a bunch of college co-eds. I'm not interested in that. But the research that's in it is good. And it's geared towards young people. And, in 4 days, you could give them 600% more information than they currently have. And they will absolutely need it. There's no way they're not going to need it.
Exactly.
Yeah. That's my passion. That's my soapbox.
Empty faces, covered in scars, spreading fake skin, passing me by.
Parentless is recorded in Phoenix, Arizona. Find us on social media and any podcast platform. Music provided by Colin the Coco and the Revolving Birds. Studio provided by Fat Kid Productions. Check out one of the many shows available on our network. I'm your host, Stephanie Relaford. Thank you for listening to Parentless.